Now called to order. It is June 4th, 2025, and the time is 6:34 p.m. Our mission is to provide a safe and caring climate and culture in which we engage, inspire, educate, prepare, and empower all learners in partnership with their surrounding community to be successful in today's and tomorrow's society. Heather is not here tonight, so Scott will be leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Scott. And then when you're ready, can you please call roll?
Shannon Hawes.
Here.
Diana Fenton.
Here.
Zach Dorholt. Here. Al Dahlgren.
Here.
Natalie Copeland.
Here.
Scott Andreasen is here. The following board members are not present. Heather Weems. The following cabinet members and staff are present at the District Administration Office. Superintendent Dr. Lori Putnam, Assistant Superintendent of Secondary Education, Dr. Jason Harris, Assistant Superintendent of E through 5 Learning, Nikki Hansen, Assistant Superintendent of E through 12 Educational Services, Shannon Avenson, Executive Director of Finance and Business Services, Amy Skellerud, Executive Director of Operations, Joel Highcamp, Media Technicians, Paul Novak and Gordy Scott. Custodian on site is Austin Goodwater.
Thank you, Scott. Then I'm looking for a motion to approve tonight's Board of Education meeting and work session agenda. Do I have a motion?
So move.
I have a motion by Scott, a second by Natalie. Scott, can you call vote again?
Diana Fenton.
Yes.
Zach Dorholt. Yes. Al Dahlgren.
Yes.
Natalie Copeland.
Yes.
Scott Andreasen is yes. Shannon Hawes.
Yes. Thank you. Then we have the consent agenda. The consent agenda consists of non-controversial items the board adopts routinely without debate. Any single member may remove an item from the consent agenda by requesting removal at the time the consent agenda is moved for adoption. Item on tonight's consent agenda. Item A, approval of personnel staff changes. Item B, approval of monthly financial report for April 2025. Item C, approval of monthly treasurer's report for April 2025. Item D, approval of proposed revised board policy 701, establishment and adoption of school district budget, third reading. Item E, bid award for milk. Item F, approval of proposed revised board policy 807, health and safety policy, minor changes. And item G, approval of proposed revised board policy 905, advertising, reviewed and no changes. At this time, does any member wish to remove an item from the consent agenda? Okay, then I'm looking for a motion to approve the consent agenda as read.
So move.
I have a motion by Scott, a second by Natalie. Scott, can you call vote again?
Zach Dorholt. Yes. Al Dahlgren.
Yes.
Natalie Copeland.
Yes.
Scott Andreasen is yes. Shannon Hawes.
Yes.
Diana Fenton.
Yes.
Thank you again. Okay, we have two action items tonight. First up is the parochial school boundary transportation adjustments for the 2025-2026 school year. And Joel Heitkamp, Executive Director of Operations, is presenting. Welcome, Joel.
Good evening, Board Chair Hawes, Superintendent Putnam, and members of the board. I'm here tonight to share an update to the private elementary school transportation boundaries that have been in place here within the district for a number of years. Just for past history, the map shown on the screen is what has been in place for quite some time. And just on the bottom there, I did put a little blurb from the statute that allows for the board the management and method to which we transport our parochial school students if there are multiple schools within our boundaries. We were recently notified by St. Mary's Help of Christian, that is the parochial school that currently resides down in the St. Augusta area, that they will not be open for the coming year. And so we are proposing to the board tonight, and our recommendation is that the St. Mary's Help of Christian current area gets absorbed by the St. Wendelin School area in Luxembourg. And we worked with our transportation router. We currently serve approximately 12 families from St. Mary's Help of Christian. And when we routed those families to other parochial schools, it made the most sense for both ride times and district impact to combine the two areas together. And so while geographically that looks large, it keeps all of our transportation on the west side of the river, which we know is a boundary and a barrier for us. And you'll notice that the St. Catherine Drexel area is also large, but again, uses that river as a boundary. And so, again, our recommendation this evening is that this becomes the new transportation boundary map for our parochial schools. Any questions?
Okay, any good, Al?
I would move that we approve the parochial school boundary transportation adjustments for the 2025-2026 school year as presented.
And do I have a second? Okay, I have a motion by Al, a second by Zach. Any discussion at all? All right, Scott, will you call vote again?
Al Dahlgren,
Yes.
Natalie Copeland,
Yes.
Scott Andreasen is yes. Shannon Hawes.
Yes.
Diana Fenton.
Yes.
Zach Dorholt.
Okay, thank you. And then our other action item tonight is the approval of the 2025-2026 executive contracts and board personnel negotiations committee chair Natalie Copeland is presenting.
Thank you, Chair Hawes. All of you got an email with a bunch of items attached in regards to this item that we're talking about today, a couple days ago. But just to review, we're talking about the 25-26 executive contract approvals. And the Personnel Committee recommends to the full board to approve the 25-26 contracts for the executive team based on the proposal of the superintendent. 4 of the executives out of the 8 are new to their positions for the 25-26 year, and the board is approving their first executive contracts and starting salaries. The other 4 of the executives are continuing in their contracts, and salary adjustments were proposed for internal alignment on the executive team, with adjustments to recognize longevity, job responsibilities, and market comparisons. One clear change in these contracts reflects the board's request to move a 3% performance pay provision out of the contract and into the base salary for transparency. For continuing executives, there is a salary increase of 2% for 25-26, consistent with a low average annual settlement over the past 8 rounds of bargaining. These are all one-year contracts, leaving the 26-27 contracts open for resolution during the process of bargaining of the 25-27 contract period for all bargaining and employee groups. So we're looking for a motion and a second, and requesting approval for these 8 contracts.
Okay. Looking for a motion or any questions at all?
I have a question.
I apologize. Community input is not open right now.
So move.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion by Scott and a second by Natalie. Any discussion at all? Okay, Scott, do you want to call vote again, please?
Natalie Copeland.
Yes.
Scott Andreasen is yes. Shannon Hawes.
Yes.
Diana Fenton.
Yes.
Zach Dorholt. Al Dahlgren.
Yes.
Okay, Thank you. That was it for our action items. Moving on to reports. We have the Board of Education Standing Committee reports. I believe we have three. Board Development Policy Governance Committee Chair Zach Dorholt. Do you have a report?
I do. So committee met on May 28th. Executive Director in Finance and Business Services, Amy Scalrud, presented proposed Board Policy 802. Executive Director of Operations, Joel Heidekamp, presented proposed Board Policy 699 and 807. Assistant Superintendent Evenson presented proposed Board Policy 905. Policies were reviewed, and Policy 807 and 905 were recommended to move forward to tonight's consent agenda. Policy 699 and 802 were recommended to move forward for a first read, and that is our report.
Thank you. Then Board Finance and Audit Committee, Chair Heather Weems is not here, and so we have Board Member Al Dahlgren presenting.
Yeah, the Board Finance Committee met for a second meeting in May to review a couple of different agenda items. The first one was the non-public transportation boundaries, which Joel covered just a few minutes ago. So I'm not going to go into that one. It was the same information he shared. And the second item was the 2025-2026 preliminary budget, and Amy is going to be sitting at the table over here going through it page by page, so I'm not going to expound on that one. Those were the two topics we had, so.
Okay, thank you. And then Personnel Negotiations Committee, we're being very redundant tonight. Chair Natalie Copeland.
You've heard some of it before. We talked about three things at our meeting on May 27th. One was that the superintendent reported on her 24-25 goals and proposed goals for 25-26 with feedback from the committee and then all of you and your one-on-ones as well. And the committee also reviewed the plan for year 3 of the annual evaluation of the superintendent. And we talked about the following timeline for the process, and you know some of this already because you've gotten a few emails. But May 29th, the board members were sent a survey focused on the rubric items related to relationship with the board and community relations. And we're going to, on June 11th, the board survey data will be shared with the Personnel Committee. On June 24th, the Personnel Committee will meet to prepare a draft report of the superintendent's evaluation for review of the board in a closed session. That closed session was added to your calendars for July 16th. 8:30 a.m. to 10. And then on July 23rd, we will report on the superintendent evaluation to the public at our regular board meeting. And the last item was executive contracts, which we already approved, and that is all.
Thank you. Then moving on to future agenda items, the June 18th, 2025 board meeting topics will include early childhood update, 10-year long-term facilities maintenance update, approval of long-term facilities maintenance, approval of 2024-2025 revised budget, approval of 25-26 budget, and some policy readings. At this time, does any board member wish to suggest a future agenda item? Al?
Didn't I hear that graduation ceremony provisions are going to be coming forward to the board sometime in the next month, or in the next 2 meetings?
July, I believe. So this is.
Was it in July? Okay.
Yep. And so these
Okay.
are the topics
Okay.
for June 18th.
Okay.
And that one is coming together, yeah. Okay. That was everything for our regular board meeting. So I'm looking for a motion to adjourn our board meeting so we can open up our work session.
So move.
We have a motion by Scott, a second by Natalie. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so board meeting is adjourned at 6:48 PM, and at that same time, we are opening up the Board of Education work session. First up, we have the preliminary 2025-2026 budget, and Amy Scalrud, Executive Director of Finance and Business Services, is presenting.
Good evening, Chair Haas, Superintendent Putnam, school board members. I did give you a paper copy of this because it's a lot of numbers and it does not project well onto the screen. So you should have that in front of you. In the interest of time and my voice, if you can't tell, I'm a little under the weather. So this will be a little bit more abbreviated than usual because I'm not sure how long I'm going to last. But we won't go through every page. We'll hit the highlights, but certainly if there's things that you have questions on or things that you see that we don't cover, feel free to jump in or to ask questions at the end. So most of the time, we're going to focus on the back of the book where it does the individual multi-year statements for each fund. But we will quickly, before we jump to the back, go to page 4. Page 4 is where we look at our special education and EL cross subsidies, which we know is a big impact on our overall budget. And it's something that we want to review every year. So starting with special education, which is the top of the page, you can see the about 3/4 there from the bottom, the funding shortfall line. We made really good progress going from 22-23 into 23-24, the year that the cross-subsidy aid was put into place. We saw a nice decline in the cross-subsidy at that time. However, you can see it's starting to trend back upwards. And that's kind of two factors as we look at 25-26. So the first factor in that is just the way the funding formula works. When we have to add staff, there's a delay in the funding. And so if we have to add positions and increase expenditures, we don't see any revenue from those increased costs until the following year. We are in a position right now based on our student counts for special education where we have added both licensed and non-licensed staff for next year. And so that's part of that impact. The other part of that is the proration of the special education transportation aid. We did do this budget with that 95% proration that was in the governor's proposal, which details aren't out yet, but the preliminary does show a decrease in special education transportation. I assume that's to the 95% that was proposed by the governor. And so we already have that factored into our budget. But clearly, if we're reducing special education revenues, that's going to impact the cross subsidy because it's taking funding away, but we know there's no costs going away. So that's kind of where we're at with the special education. And then the EL cross subsidy has been really relatively consistent across the years. We are expected to see that go down in fiscal year 27. So not this budget year, but the next year. There's some EL cross subsidy specific aid that is set to start. Of course, that's assuming that there's no changes to that next legislative session. And so we don't 100% know that we'll end up with that, but right now, as the law sets right now, we would see that go down when we budget for next year if that aid comes through. Okay, we're gonna skip then to page 21 and start going through kind of all of the individual numbers for each fund. Page 21 is a summary of the general fund, which is really 3 separate funds. So when we see the audit presentation in November, we see one general fund. That is really the combination of these 3 separate funds: operating, transportation, and operating capital. We'll look at them each individually, but just that awareness that we still show them as kind of 3 separate funds and account for them individually. But from an audit perspective and actually from the state, those actually combine all into the general fund for reporting purposes. Page 22 then looks at the actual operating fund, which is the majority of the general fund. Looking at revenues first, we see finally in this budget going back to what I would call a normal distribution of revenues. So this budget reflects revenues from the state of about $133 million, which is about 85% of our total revenue, which really is where it has historically been. If we look back at some of these other years in the multi-year comparison, we can see significant drops in that and then increases in the federal because of the COVID funds. But we're really back to that kind of normal 85% from the state, about 6.5% from taxes, and about 6% from federal revenue. Excuse me. Moving to expenditures, it looks a little bit goofy here on the expenditure line because our expenditures are going down. The reason for that is because if you look at kind of the bottom line or in middle of the page, change in fund balance, you see a $4 million deficit for the revised budget for 24-25. That is the spending of those assigned fund balances when the board received the kind of the overlap in the state aid and the federal ESSER funds. If you think way back to when we became aware of that, the board approved that spending plan. The largest portions of that being McKinley, the addition there, and then the Apollo Theater improvements. And so that went into an assigned fund balance. So at the very bottom, there's a breakdown of the fund balance. You can see at the end of 23-24, there was about 4.5 million of that board designated money that was left. And a lot of that just is timing, right? Because those were summer projects and projects that extended into the school year. And so that deficit that is in the 24-25 readopted budget is really fully coming from that assigned fund balance. You can see that going down by that $4 million with a minimal change in the unrestricted fund balance. There is a small decrease projected in the unassigned for 24-25, and that is due to some city special assessments. And so originally we had thought that those were going to come next year. We actually got the invoices for those now, and so there's actually 2 rounds of them, and so there's about $100,000 deficit that we expect to spend down our unreserved fund balance in the current year, 24-25, and then about another 200,000 next year. In addition, next year, when we look at that overall net change in fund balance, we're projecting about a $325,000 decrease. Again, 200,000 of that is those city special assessments for water, sewer, stormwater improvements, and then we also have the cost for the special election, and that's the 2 items that are resulting in that spend down of fund balance, which is what fund balance is for. It is for one-time costs that are unexpected. There is also a detailed breakdown of all of the expenditures by a more thorough listing of subcategories on pages 23-25. We're not going to look over those, but if you see something that jumps out at you or that you have a question on, certainly feel free to let me know. Then we'll skip to page 26. Page 26 is the transportation fund. There's relatively small increases in revenue and expenses for fiscal year 26. However, that's a little bit of an illusion, I would say, because the increases would have been larger. However, we have 2 charter schools next year who are opting out of district transportation. And so our overall transportation costs per route are clearly going up. Transportation costs increase year over year. However, we will have a reduction in routes because of those 2 schools not being transported by us. There's also a corresponding reduction in revenue because we do get the state aid, the state transportation aid for those students. We're conservatively budgeting the revenue and the expense reduction to be roughly the same. Our hope, because we know that there's cost subsidies that exist for transportation, but it's really hard to nail down exactly what that is, and it's very specific based on routing. So we may realize some further reductions in costs, but we want to budget conservatively until routing is done, because we know at this point in the budget process that routing isn't complete. We don't exactly know how many routes we'll be able to reduce, but there will be a reduction in costs and revenue because of that change. I will also note that while the transportation budget looks like it's great and it's balanced and we get all the revenue we need to run transportation, this is just the transportation fund, which only accounts for transportation dedicated revenues. The general fund does cover, the general operating fund does cover about 1.5 million in additional transportation costs that are in excess of the transportation specific funding that we receive. So it's a little bit of a false picture, but just don't want to be, I want to make sure the board is aware of that. Moving to page 27, this is the third and final component of the general fund, which is operating capital. The operating capital fund does include, and really the majority of the spending of this fund is for our long-term facilities maintenance program. Pretty consistent expending kind of year over year. There is a small projected deficit in the 24-25 readopted budget. That is for the replacement of our phone system. We had thought that that was going to actually occur next year, but in terms of when they could get that work scheduled to do the install, that's actually this year, and there wasn't adequate room within the existing budget to cover that, and so that's what that deficit is for. There was some intentional spend down of these reserves for operating capital in some previous years, but even with those intentional spend and the current year deficit, the operating capital fund is still sitting with a very healthy reserve fund balance of over $2 million. Okay, if you flip to page 30, we'll move on to our special revenue funds. There are two special revenue funds, food service and community service. Food service is the first one we'll look at on page 30. Looking at the revenues, so about 95% or just over 95% of our revenue at this point comes from federal revenue. Because of the way that the new state meal program works and the requirement to participate in the federal community eligibility provision program, the way that that program works ends up with us having almost all of our revenue for those meals coming from federal revenue. The good news with that is if in the next legislative session, for some reason, something were to change and the state were to repeal that food program, which is probably not likely, but even if there were changes at the state level, our funding, because we're in that community eligibility program, wouldn't be impacted by those changes, at least for another 3 years, which is when our 5-year current CEP commitment expires. One other thing I'll note, because it does look a little bit strange anytime we see spending go down, we see a decrease here in both revenues and expenditures. And the reason for that is because we have a federal fresh fruit and vegetable program grant for our elementary schools that is reflected in the actual activity for all of the preceding years, as well as the 24-25 budget. We don't have final allocation amounts on that yet, so we always add those once we get them. And so that is the reason that it looks like it's going down, but it's really not. Again, this fund has a very healthy fund balance, about $2.8 million, with the majority of that increase coming in 21-22 during the pandemic, when we had a lot of money coming in for meals and not a lot of meals being served. And so we will be working with our food service department to do some planned spend downs. Details haven't been released yet, but there is information coming from the initial legislative summaries from what's been agreed upon, that there's some changes in the flexibility of allowable costs. And so that may give us a better ability to spend some of those funds. Right now, what you can spend food service funds on are pretty restricted to certain pieces of equipment. It can't be electrical work, it can't be remodeling. So it really doesn't give you a lot of options to spend a significant amount of money, which I think is what's behind some of the push at the legislature to broaden that list. So we will see what's included in that and make sure we have a plan to spend that. There is a requirement to have no more than 3 months of expenditures in your fund balance. That requirement has been extended to 6 months and has been extended for 1 more year. And we're not significantly higher than the 3-month mark, but we are over it. So we'll just want to be mindful of that, and we'll make sure that we have a plan for spending. Moving to page 31, Community Education Fund. Activity really very consistent year over year. I will note both the 24-25 and 25-26 readopted budgets show deficits. These are levy adjustments related to our school age care program, which is part of our after-school childcare program with the Boys and Girls Club. Unfortunately, the way our levy system works is when we levy something, it's 3 years after that that we actually true up expenses. So we are actually recognizing levy adjustments for 21, 22, and 22, 23 fiscal years where spending ended up less than what we levied for because of the pandemic and so there's unfortunately a delay. The good news is that when we levy for something and we don't spend it, that money goes to fund balance. So that money is really just pulling those school age care funds back out of the fund balance because we can't spend them on anything other than that program. So that is the reason for that deficits. And as you can see, similar to food service and operating capital, this fund has consistently had a very healthy reserve fund balance. Going to page 33, this is our capital projects fund. For 24-25, the majority of the spending in this fund really is related to the bond proceeds from the previous year for the long-term facilities maintenance, bonds for the improvements at Apollo High School. There's a little bit of continued spending on Apollo work as a follow-up in 25-26 that you see budgeted. And then there's also in 25-26 a $700,000 debt service payment coming out of this fund. When we finished the Quarry View Education Center project, that was funded with lease levy proceeds, and there was money remaining that is sitting in an account that can't be used for anything else. And so we're doing levy adjustments kind of as we're able to have the negative levy adjustments and reduce the debt service levy to recover basically or spend down those funds. And so that's what the loan repayment line is in the capital projects fund. It wouldn't be typical otherwise to see any sort of loan repayment or debt activity in the projects fund. But it's because of that unique nuance with that project where those funds can't be spent for anything else. I will note that we will also have budget adjustments in 25-26 for this fund. We will have probably not significant construction costs, but we will clearly start to have some construction management and architect costs related to the recently passed referendum. And we'll see that in the debt service fund as well, that will have a budget adjustment in 25-26 to account for those bonds being issued as well. Page 35 is the debt service fund. Really nothing super exciting to mention here. This fund is pretty straightforward. It accounts for all of the required debt service payments and then has the corresponding revenue that we levy to cover them. Again, as I mentioned, we will see a significant budget adjustment in 25-26 to account for those bond proceeds. We didn't put that in the original budget because we don't know the exact amounts yet, but those bonds are set to close on July 1st and the money come in, and so we'll be making that adjustment once that happens. We'll skip ahead. We don't have a fiduciary fund anymore. That used to be our trust fund to account for scholarships, which are now part of the general fund. So we'll move to page 40, which is the first of technically 3 internal service funds, although the first one on page 40 isn't actually active anymore. As we look to 25-26, this was our OPEB trust fund. We, at the end of 23-24, transferred any funds remaining in here into the health insurance fund. There's a little bit of revised budget in 24-25, just some kind of cleanup interest before that transfer could occur based on timing, but then we won't see any activity in this fund going forward. It's fully closed out at this point. Next page, page 41, is our dental insurance fund. This fund, very consistent activity year over year. It's maintained a healthy reserve for a number of years, and really no significant changes or anything to note there. Page 42, on the other hand, is a little bit of a different story with our health insurance fund. We know that we had some nice growth in our reserves in 1920 and 2021 during the pandemic when we were collecting premiums, but obviously, services weren't being provided and people weren't utilizing their plans. Since then, we know things are back to usual. Medical costs have continued to increase. And so we have seen, both in last year's actual and in this year's revised projected, some large spend downs of those reserves. Some of that being planned, very intentional by the LMC committee and what the board approved when they set rates last year for this plan year. But some of that also unexpected, just based on high cost claimants and overall medical costs just being more higher increases than what was originally projected. This does show a balanced budget for 25-26. Based on where our reserves are projected to end at the end of this 24-25 school year, we wouldn't expect a recommendation to come through LMC that would be advocating for further spend down of reserves. And so that's why you see a balanced budget. As far as what that means for plan design rates, that will come to the board in August as it goes through, as we finish that RFP process over the next month, and that goes through LMC this summer. Page 44 we'll look at quickly, has a enrollment trend and projection. We know we had a significant decrease from 1920 to 2021 after the pandemic. And there was smaller increases the 2 years following. However, we've seen increases every year since then, and we continue to project increases into the following years. And then I will also note you see going from 23-24 to 24-25, a nice increase in our pre-K. And that's because we had additional sites approved for VPK. And so that's what's driving that pre-K line is really just our VPK that gets funded through the general fund. On page 45 is our 5-year levy comparison. We did have a small increase in our tax rate. And when I say tax rate, we don't set tax rates, but we take the dollar amount that we can levy based on the statutory formulas and kind of artificially convert it into a rate just for comparison purposes. That did go up a little bit from 24-25 to 25-26, but still has a large decrease overall in the 5 years presented, just because of the way that we levy and the restrictions that we have on the amount we can levy, and with what has happened in terms of overall tax capacity and tax base increases. Those increases have outpaced our dollar amount increases, which is over the 5 years basically resulted in a decrease in what we're taxing if you were to look at it on a rate basis. And we know schools are unlike cities and counties where they set a rate. And so while rates were significantly increasing, those entities had the benefit of being able to collect significant additional funds as the property valuations were going up at astronomical, unprecedented rates. We unfortunately don't have that same luxury. So, and then page 46 is our table of 5 years of staffing levels. And so we are showing a slight increase in staff for next year, which sounds strange, right? Given that we've made reductions. However, if you look at it by category, it's mostly in our hourly and our non-licensed and our support positions. We have decreases in our directors, our supervisors. We have most of the increase really is coming in paraeducators. Some of those, funded by buildings. The majority of that in the area of special education, as we've had those increasing needs. A little bit of an increase in food service, but overall relatively consistent. And our teacher number is very comparable to where we were for 24-25 actual. Then some of that's a shift, right? Some of that might be an increase in special education teachers and a decrease in other areas as we reprioritize those compensatory funds. But overall, not a lot of changes otherwise, except for those few categories. I'm not going to go over page 47. There's no significant changes in our activities information from year to year. That tends to stay pretty consistent. Where we do see decreases in expenditures is typically because of carryover funds. And so the budgets and the revised budgets might include unspent money from previous years. Those aren't reflected yet in the 25-26 budget. It's highly likely that when we look at the amounts in 24-25, there's funds in there that they won't have spent by the end of 24-25, and they'll end up rolling to next year. So some of that can be a timing, just timing between years. And then the last 2 pages are the curriculum review cycle, which I know nothing about, but if you have questions, I'm sure that Nikki or Jason would be glad to answer them. Are there any questions?
I don't say this nearly enough. I appreciate you. Wow. Anybody have any questions at all? Al?
I don't really have any questions, but just thanks to Amy for lots of long hours in putting it together. There's a lot that goes into the school district budget, and there's a lot of lines and a lot of different budget codes, and it takes a lot of knowledge to know what goes where and to put together a budget. And the one thing that I know about Amy is that the budget that she puts together is a very conservative budget. So it's very likely that we'll meet the numbers. We won't exceed it's very likely that we will exceed revenue numbers and maintain expense numbers for the coming year. And so we always come in with a balanced budget. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You're probably not going too far. Let's see here. Nope, you're not leaving, huh? So next up, we have some board policies. We have proposed revised board policy 721. It is the second reading, uniform grant guidance policy regarding federal revenue resources.
And there were no changes from the first reading unless there are questions.
Okay, so we'll roll right into proposed revised board policy 704, second reading, development and maintenance of an inventory of fixed assets and fixed assets accounting systems, again presented by Amy.
And again, no changes from the first reading.
Okay, we're going to do a little jumping here.
We didn't plan this well, it's fine. Now let's see if it'll let me get off.
We have 2 policies left. The next one is the proposed revised board policy 699. This is a first reading of closing of district facilities due to inclement weather or other emergency conditions. And this one is brought to us by Joel Heitkamp, Executive Director of Operations.
All right, good evening. Thanks for having me back. Shannon's going to present for me this evening. Policy 699 does not have a model policy, just for reference. MSBA does not provide one. Looks like the school district started one back in 2018. It's been revised a number of times, but it was due. And so Shannon, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down, just 2 kind of wordsmithing additions that went through board development. And number 2 there is in regard to the conversation that I typically have in the early mornings with our bus contractors, and those are the things that we talk about, just considering what perspective they bring to that decision when I am able to give that recommendation to Superintendent Putnam. And so just adding a couple of clarifying pieces there that go into that conversation that happens each time we're concerned about the weather. The only other addition or change is at the very bottom, and that's, again, just a little bit of wordsmithing. And it came out of a situation that actually happened this year when we had that unexpected 5 or 6 inches of snow on a Wednesday afternoon. And so the board development team just kind of reiterated that all faculty and all staff are following their individual contracts, but also then gives Superintendent Putnam the ability to give direction if she feels that we're going to deviate from those, which we did on that day because it was in the safety interest of others to get people home with that longer day on a Wednesday. And so that was the addition that was added to that part.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on that first reading? Okay, one more item up. We have Amy Scallerid back for a first reading, proposed revised board policy 802, disposition of obsolete equipment and material.
Okay, there are a few changes to this policy. The first one is really just technical cleanup, and actually changed in MSBA's policy quite a few years ago when the state bid threshold changed from 100,000 to 175,000. At that time, we somehow caught changing the policies on the purchasing side, but overlooked the fact that they were also included in this disposition policy. So there's a couple different places where that's changing that threshold from 100,000 to 175,000. It is highly unlikely that we would ever be getting rid of anything that has a resale value of 100, let alone 175, but it's in the policy just in case. So that is the change on page 1 and then also on page 2. And then there was one change that was a recent change in MSBA's sample policy. The statute does allow for an exception for surplus school computers to be disposed of in a different manner that doesn't necessarily follow public bidding. And so they updated their policy to specify that a tablet device like an iPad is also considered a school computer, that you could dispose of those in that same manner. So we've made that change. And then they added what is our number 4, which allows you so basically the exception for school computers allows you, without doing any sort of public bidding, to convey that property to another school district, the Department of Corrections, the state colleges and universities, and then they've added a charitable organization that is intended and designed for educational use. So we've added that. The statute and the policy has always had the previous number 4, which is to the family of a student residing in the district whose total family income meets the federal definition of poverty. That allowable exception for disposing of computers has always been in the law. It is not something that our district does, nor would we be able to do. The way we have our device rotation set up, our secondary devices, when they no longer have protection and we don't want students taking them home, cycle down to elementary. That's how we have classroom devices for elementary. And we are using them at elementary until they have no value left. So this is not something that we utilize as a district. And so when we reviewed this at Board Finance Committee, the recommendation was to strike that. We don't want to have a policy that gives our families an impression that this is an opportunity that they might be able to participate in. And so the decision was just to remove that, knowing that that is not something that, given the way we do our device rotation, is something that we'll ever have a plan to do. So that is the reason for that change. And then there's just some cleanup in the legal reference and cross-reference sections.
Okay, any questions on this first reading? All right, thank you very much. That's everything on our agenda for tonight. So I'm looking for a motion to adjourn tonight's work session. I have a motion by Zach, a second by Natalie. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Work session is adjourned at 7:22 PM. Have a good night. Thanks for watching. We'll be back on June 18th.
When you put me as most of the agenda.